Alrighty. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Aaron and I'm a Regenerative Agricultural Officer here in the ACT Sustainable Ag team. I'm here today joined with the rest of the team, Jared, Mary and Jenny. Thank you very much for being here and taking time out of your day for this webinar. We're really excited to explore grazing resilience with Judi Earl. So this webinar is possible thanks to funding provided by the Future Drought Fund and the Farm Business Resilience Program. So I'd firstly like to just acknowledge the Ngunnawal peoples as the traditional custodians of the land in which we are meeting on today, and recognise any other people or families with connection to the lands of the ACT and region. I would also like to extend that respect to any other First Nation peoples joining us here today. So just a little bit of housekeeping too before we start. If everybody could please keep their mics on mute during the presentation. And then we will have about 30 minutes towards the end for a discussion. We'll also keep track of your questions if you could just chuck them in the chat box during the presentation. The team and I will keep track of them all. Okay, so Judi, are you ready to start? And I can hand over to you.
Ready to roll, Aaron. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you.
Excellent. So thanks very much for the invitation and the opportunity to speak to you today. My plan for the next hour or so is to just work through a bit of an explanation of some approaches to grazing management, then spend a little bit of time on how grasses grow and respond to defoliation, which is so important in terms of grazing management, and then some factors that, management factors that will influence plant growth, and then wrap up with an approach to pasture assessment and feed budgeting, which we've developed in conjunction with landholders, mostly up here on the Northern Tablelands and the North Coast, but applicable across the board. So without going into any more detail, I'll get mobile. In terms of grazing management, okay, now it's not moving through. Oh, goodness. Here we go. I'll try this one here. That's better. Okay. All the bugs, get rid of them early. So grazing management essentially is management of the interaction between grazing animals and pasture plants. And depending on the approach that you take, that interaction can be positive or negative, leading to outcomes that either improve land condition or degrade. So there are really countless approaches, and there's just a few broad descriptions listed here. And often there'll be crossovers between approaches, and managers might implement a range of strategies within any 12-month period. But essentially the range varies from continuous grazing, which is pretty much akin to very little management, up to the more management intensive variations of cell grazing or planned grazing. And we don't really have time to go through all of them in great detail, but briefly, continuous grazing and set stocking are still quite unbelievably, to my thinking, the most common forms of grazing management practiced. And then there's many people that apply time-based rotational systems, and grazing system is a word that I really don't like to use. That systematic approach ultimately will result in decline in land condition. Then tactical and strategic grazing are terms that have become more common in use these days, and they're perfectly valid approaches for specific purposes such as weaning or finishing stock or drought management, for example, but they're not usually applicable on a whole farm basis. Techno-grazing, in my opinion, is more a fencing system. But then when you get to the more regenerative approaches to grazing management, when they're applied appropriately, cell grazing, holistic plan grazing, and forage-based plan grazing, I suppose, are the real keys, I believe. So they're the ones that I'm going to spend a bit more time on this afternoon. So cell grazing generally, or time-controlled grazing is another name for it, involves movement of stock through a number of paddocks or cells. And the stock numbers and movement is generally based on measures of herbage mass and the expected recovery period. But as I mentioned, many managers still implement time-based systems, and they often lead to failure. The Grazing for Profit course program actually lists 5 main principles that are associated with the practice of cell grazing, and those principles are listed here. That is, control the grazing to match plant growth, match stocking rate to carrying capacity, plan and monitor, manage the grazing, use those short graze periods to increase animal production, and maximise stock density for the minimum amount of time. So usually cell grazing is associated with relatively high stock density through at least 10 paddocks or cells, grazed for short periods of time. And a critical caveat is that while stock density within a cell is usually high, that utilisation of the pasture is often moderated by short graze periods. So, and again, often this might not be the case, and where animals are retained in paddocks until all the herbage mass, including the undesirable species, is reduced, animal production often is compromised, and more often than not, desirable components of the sward are often overgrazed. So where you've got situations where stocking rate and the movement is based on the measurement of herbage mass, then generally you can expect more positive outcomes. And often grazing cells could be established across a whole farm or within sections of a farm, within an individual property. And it's not uncommon for a single property to run multiple cells to cater for different classes of stock. So that's the cell grazing. Holistic plant grazing is a concept described by Alan Savory, and he really proposes the use of grazing livestock as the primary tool to regenerate land. So actually using livestock to achieve improvements in ecosystem processes, usually described in an individual's holistic goal or holistic context. And very often animal production is a secondary consideration, but generally as the land condition improves, the potential carrying capacity improves, and so too does animal production. And with holistic plant grazing, generally livestock are moved in response to plant growth, and the planning is divided into 2 quite distinct periods. So we've got the open plan applied during the growing season, and when pasture growth is quite quick, the recovery periods are planned according to the time that plants require to recover from that graze event. And generally, stock are moved relatively quickly. With a closed plan, that usually takes effect when pasture growth slows or stops, and that continues until you anticipate pasture growth to start again in the growing season. So, excuse me, at the start of that closed plan, generally you do an assessment of the feed and adjust stock numbers according to the available feed. But the key principle is when pasture growth slows, the movement of stock slows. And there's not really a recommended number of paddocks with holistic planned grazing, but they do suggest, obviously, that the greatest gains in improving land condition arise from the application of high stock density and increasing the number of paddocks available per mob. And although holistic planned grazing was initially developed and applied in relatively low rainfall, brittle environments, it's pretty much been widely accepted and successfully adopted right across Australia in many regions, including the high rainfall zones. So the last one that I wanted to introduce just as part of this introduction process is what I've called forage-based plant grazing. And this was really developed by myself and a previous partner in AIMS, it really in response to observed deficiencies in soil grazing and holistic plan grazing, and particularly in high rainfall zones. Lots of people were not going through that process of doing the calculations required to develop a grazing chart. So we developed an Excel spreadsheet based on feed budgeting, which I'm going to talk much more about a bit later on. And it really does require an understanding and an ability to measure herbage mass, to measure pasture growth, and also keep track of animal requirements. So generally, stocking rates based on seasonal feed budgeting, and the movement of stock is planned to ensure an optimal amount of herbage mass is retained throughout the year to enhance pasture growth rate. So amalgamation of mobs is encouraged, and generally I suggest at least 15 paddocks per mob is applied, but it can be successfully applied with as few as 4 or 5 paddocks. But there's a big focus on maintaining a residual herbage mass and planning the grazing to achieve those predetermined target residuals. And again, I'll talk much more about those as we progress through the next hour. But the key principle is that the grazing is planned appropriate for each individual paddock. So it's grazed for an appropriate period of time based on the number of animals, based on the amount of herbage mass that's present, and based on how much you want to leave behind after any graze event. And so the key principles are there, and definitely a focus on actually measuring herbage mass and basing the movements on the available herbage mass. And another key term that is on that slide is utilisation. And again, that's an important part of the process, and that refers to the proportion of the pasture that's grown that is consumed by livestock. And again, we'll be talking to that in a bit more detail through the next little while. So why is grazing management important? Basically, the main objective in any form of primary production is really to maximise the capture of sunlight energy. And of course, animal production starts with photosynthesis, and maximising photosynthesis is really critical for land health and soil health. And in terms of the soil, it's mainly due to the effect on plant roots. So plant health is significantly influenced by defoliation and the level and frequency of defoliation. And basically, the health of the pasture and the health of the soil is dictated by the amount of roots that are present in the soil profile. And it's important to keep in mind that even though the pasture is and the paddock is your management unit, that the actual grazing process occurs one plant at a time, and that's the level of change. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about how grasses grow and how they respond to defoliation, because it really is key in terms of determining determining the impact of the grazing management that you're applying. So a really important feature of grasses that you should be aware of is that what you see above the ground in terms of herbage mass is a reflection of what's below the ground in terms of root biomass. And the roots really are the most vulnerable and ecologically most important organ of the plant. So we really need to orientate our management towards encouraging root biomass and root density, but it's really tricky to manage what you can't see. So understanding this feature of perennial grasses gives you the capacity to have a bit of an idea of what's going on below the soil surface, and how your management might be impacting on those soil processes. So another feature of grasses, and I make no apology for focusing on grasses because grasses are the backbone of grasslands and generally the backbone of your pasture systems. So there will be a definite focus on perennial grasses and how they grow. So the key thing is that pretty much all grasses grow in the same basic sigmoidal fashion outlined here. They start off their growth early. Obviously, warm season grasses will have a different growth pattern to cool season grasses, but they all grow in this same basic fashion. They start with relatively slow growth and get to this period where the structural material increases and go through a rapid period of growth until they go into the reproductive phase. So generally the quality, the digestibility and the energy and the protein increases up to a point. Once they flower, the digestibility and the quality declines. And then once those plants senesce, quality declines even further. So from an animal production perspective, the optimal time for grazing from in terms of the nutritive value of the plant is towards the end of phase 1 and early phase 2. But the optimal time for plant persistence and resilience of pastures is towards the end of phase 2, where you've got optimal amount of leaf material, but just prior to those plants going into the reproductive phase. So if you can actually manage to keep those perennial grasses on this steep part of the growth curve, it enhances the persistence and the resilience of those plants, and it also results in an increase in pasture growth. So it's really a matter of sort of shifting the focus from this lower part of the curve up to a higher part of the growth curve to enhance growth and enhance outcomes in terms of the land health. So just again focusing on individual plants, tussock grasses are the main form that occur in most pastures, or ideally at least. There are other forms, but just for today, we'll focus on the tussock grasses. And a key feature of the tussock grasses and a factor that gives perennial grasses their perenniality, if you like, is that these grasses are made up of a number of independent but connected units called tillers. So each tiller actually has its own associated root system and can be a viable unit if separated from the parent plant. And in terms of the growth points, there are a number of growth points, but from a grazing management perspective, the main points of interest are the leaf tips. So the growth points are within about 1 to 2 centimetres of the tip of those new tillers, and this basal node is really critical in terms of the productive potential of grasses. So looking at the basal growth points of Phalaris, you've got at the base of each tiller what's called the node, and then these auxiliary buds. And these buds, when the plant is dormant, the energy is going into creating these auxiliary buds, which develop into new tillers and basically new season growth. So it's really important in terms of managing the dormant plant to try and manage to optimize the number of these auxiliary buds that are developed through that dormant period. So the energy in a dormant plant is going into basically forming these new growth points for the new season. And looking at a Phalaris plant in spring, this dug this out of my garden quite some time ago, and it keeps getting a run in these sorts of presentations. But what you've got here is a relatively new growth, early spring growth. You've got senesced leaves, you've got these auxiliary buds, which were mentioned in that previous diagram. And Phalaris is really handy because these new tillers are actually coloured pink. So you can see, I'll go to the next slide, there's about in the photo, there's about 13 or 14 new tillers developing. And in terms of defoliation, the importance of the location of these tillers becomes really critical. So if we were to defoliate this plant to 5 centimetres, which is indicated by that yellow line, then there's one new tiller that is above that height. And so defoliation at 5 centimetres would destroy that one tiller. But these tillers that are existing below that 5 centimetre height basically avoid any damage. But if we were to defoliate that plant down to this level, which is equivalent to about 2 centimetres above the surface, then you can see there I've numbered those tillers because the tips are above that 2 centimetre height. Those tillers are basically destroyed with that defoliation event. So leaving 5 centimetres on that plant, the regrowth comes from photosynthesis from those green leaves, and very little damage or restriction to root biomass occurs. But if we defoliate that plant down to 2 centimetres, then immediately 10 of those new tillers are destroyed, and the energy for regrowth, because there's limited green leaf there, limited photosynthetic area, the energy for regrowth has to come from the root system. So roots actually die to provide the energy to drive the regrowth for those smaller tillers that avoided defoliation in that particular event. So roots start to die within about 20 minutes of defoliation if there's insufficient photosynthetic area to drive regrowth. And so that is really critical in understanding the response of plants to defoliation and the rate of regrowth. So I did a trial quite some time ago now when I was doing my postgraduate work, and what I wanted to do was look at the impact of defoliation on a range of plants. This one in particular that I'm showing you is just Phalaris, to keep on the Phalaris theme, but defoliating to 3 centimetres, so I wanted to have some impact on the root system. And I grew these plants for 12 months in the pots were 1 metre high, and they were PVC pipes, so that's why the roots appear as they do in this photograph. And then I cut a treatment every 2 weeks, another every 4 weeks, and another one every 8 weeks, down to 3 centimetres above the soil surface. And then I left another treatment uncut for 12 months. And at the end of that 12-month period, the actual amount of shoot and root that was left on those plants at the end of that 12-month period is in this graph. And you can see very nicely, again, that the amount of shoot material is in about very close to a 1-to-1 ratio in terms of the leaf and root biomass that was present. And that's after 12 months of treatment. So even defoliating plants to 8 weeks, the root biomass did not approximate the plants that were uncut during that period. So I'm not suggesting to you that 8 weeks is the ideal period. It was the trial was run under quite obviously strict control in terms of the timing and the height of defoliation, but it just demonstrates the impact of the frequency of defoliation to a height that is less than optimal in terms of the root biomass of those plants. And that was consistent across the 8 different species that I was looking at in that trial. So it's quite dramatic, the impact of excessive defoliation on root biomass of plants. So this diagram from Alan Savory basically shows the same thing, perhaps in a certainly more schematic detail, but it certainly shows the impact of excessive defoliation on root biomass as well as the rate of regrowth. And you can see there, plant A defoliated more severely than plant B. You get an immediate reduction in the root biomass, and relatively slower rates of regrowth of the leaves, and more rapid regeneration of leaf and root material. Obviously, the actual time for recovery from defoliation is going to depend on a whole raft of factors, but certainly the more you leave behind on any plant after a defoliation event, the faster that regrowth is going to be. And again, if you maintain a minimum amount of green leaf, at least 5 centimetres, then you minimise the damage to the root system on temperate grasses. Tropical grasses need a little more in terms of residual leaf to minimise root damage, but focusing on the southern tablelands, most of the species you'll be dealing with will be cool season perennials. So the other important feature to identify in terms of defoliation is that the intensity and the frequency of defoliation can be compensatory. So when we talk about intensity of defoliation, that's the amount of herbage mass that's removed from those plants and the amount of residual herbage that remains. And the frequency refers to how often plants are defoliated and the time that it's going to take for leaf and shoots to regenerate, and the time particularly for roots to regenerate. So if the grazing is not so intense and you leave a good amount of residual, then you can come back and graze safely with a higher frequency. But if the grazing is quite intense and you go or remove an excessive amount of herbage mass such that the roots are damaged, then you need a relatively much longer period for plants to recover from that grazing event. So often people, when I sort of introduce these concepts, people think that, you're actually going to be wasting herbage mass. And I hope this graph is not too busy, but essentially, most commonly, and I'm assuming that people can see my cursor on the screen. Aaron, can you give me a nod if you can see that cursor? Thank you. Most often the grazing occurs between about 1,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare, which is about 3 centimetres, up to 2,500 kilograms, so somewhere between 6 and 7 centimetres, or maybe a bit more, maybe 8. And you're working in that zone there of where the herbage mass is about 1,500 kilos. So basically what I'm proposing by aiming to leave more behind is that you're actually lifting the plane of the plant where you're grazing, so that you aim to work between this sort of 2,000 or 2,500 to 4,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare in terms of the parts of the plants that you're defoliating. So you're trying to work on this plane, on this level here, where the growth rate is higher, but you're also working at a higher plane in the plant, if that makes sense. So always aiming to leave more residual behind after a graze event. So looking at pasture growth, so these are a couple of growth curves that I extracted from ProGraze. So the blue line there indicates native pasture, predominantly Microlina xanthonia. The orange line there is the growth curve for an annual-based pasture with clover. And that green line is indicative of southern tablelands pastures. So I put it in because it's obviously important to understand the changes in relative growth rate over the year, but also to understand that different pastures have actual different growth curves. And in terms of influences on pasture growth rate, most often rainfall is the key that is mentioned. So these data here, this rainfall data, is I think I got it from, well, certainly from the BOM, and I'm pretty sure it was from Queanbeyan. But the other point to note when you lay the pasture growth rate curves over that rainfall is that obviously rainfall is not necessarily the key driver of pasture growth year round. Obviously you'll have seasonal differences, And during the winter, temperature is going to be the key limiting factor to growth. But even, you know, these higher rainfalls through the summer don't necessarily equate to the same levels of growth rate as you get through the springtime in the southern tablelands. So just, you know, looking at the range of factors that influence plant growth, and these are just some of them, and I've just grouped them into environmental, plant factors, and soil factors. And obviously the environmental factors you have relatively less control over, but most of these factors in terms of the plants and the soils, you have quite a degree of influence over, and through grazing management can significantly influence the rate of plant growth by focusing on these plant and soil factors. And certainly even with rainfall, by leaving a higher residual herbage mass, the actual efficiency or water use efficiency can be influenced significantly. And again, leaving a higher amount of canopy cover, you can modify the soil surface temperature and given the key growth points of the plant are at the soil surface, modifying those diurnal changes in temperature can have significant effects on pasture growth rate. So while we usually focus on rainfall and temperature as being the key influences, there are a whole raft of other factors that, through managing the grazing, you can influence to enhance plant growth. So, you know, considering the complexities of plant growth, the complexities of the soil processes that are going on constantly below the soil surface, there are really, regardless of the type of management that you're applying in terms of your grazing, there are 4 key factors that are within your control. And I'll just spend a very brief amount of time going through each of these factors. But the recovery period is the most obvious one, allowing plants that time to recover from a defoliation event. And that is going to differ in the growing season to the non-growing season based on the time that it will take plants to recover and where they are in that growth cycle. So when you consider the effect of defoliation on plants, actually planning an appropriate recovery period is really critical. And as I mentioned, whether you're in the active growth period for your pastures or the non-growing period, the recovery period should vary accordingly. And it's important to make the distinction between rest and recovery. So just because animals are not in a paddock or the gates are closed on a paddock and they're not being grazed, if plants are not actively growing, then they're not recovering from that previous graze event. So it's really important to make that distinction. But just because plants are resting and not exposed to animals, unless they're actively growing, they're not recovering from that previous graze event. And getting it right is a constant challenge. And lots of people beat themselves up about not getting the recovery right, or you know, what's the appropriate recovery period. And the response is that it depends on the growth conditions and where those plants are in their growth cycle and what the actual environmental factors are, whether or not plants are actively growing. So it's not something that you're going to get right on a regular basis, but it's just a matter of trying to manage the grazing so that you're giving plants the optimal opportunity to recover from a graze event before animals come back around. So the graze period is going to be a function of the recovery period that you need and the desired residual that you want to leave behind. And the key thing is to try and avoid a second bite on growing plants, because it's that second bite which more often than not does the damage. and causes overgrazing of root systems on perennial grasses. But ideally, when plants are growing quickly, the graze period should be ideally shorter, and when growth is slow, the graze period can safely be that little bit longer. And then the residual. And if you can remember this mantra, the more you leave behind, the faster it grows. And so maintaining that residual is really critical, primarily to stabilise the soil surface temperature, to maintain that root biomass, to maintain ground cover, ensuring you've got maximum ground cover for the maximum period of time. Increasing biological activity, because most of the biology in the soil is associated with plant roots. So the more plant root biomass you've got there, the more biological activity you'll have. You'll have better soil structure. Maintaining good density of desirable species reduces the opportunity for those undesirable species to enter the pasture and establish. And better soil structure, better root biomass leads to an increase in soil water infiltration. So maintaining residual is really critical, and mainly because of the effect on those root systems. And more and more, I've become more convinced that the most important part of the grazing equation is what you leave behind, because the more you leave behind, the greater the growth rate post any graze event. And I just throw this one in terms of residual herbage mass, because if herbage mass is adequate, I followed this little heifer around for a little while and taking snaps of how far she was grazing each plant down, and none of these plants were grazed below 5 centimetres on the first bite. So you've got the bite down on the left there and the wrapping around of the tongue, and inevitably there was somewhere between 5 and 7 centimetres of green leaf left on each plant after she'd moved through. So when you consider that grazing occurs one plant at a time, and grazes and grasses have evolved together, I don't think there's any coincidence that the optimal residual height post-grazing is somewhere between 5 and 7 centimetres to maintain that root biomass. And it's also a convenient bite height for cattle. So once pastures get below about 2,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare, which is about 7 centimetres of height, there's an excessive amount of energy required by the animal to effectively harvest adequate nutrition. But I won't go into any more detail on that. That's for another day, perhaps. And of course, the number of animals, that stocking rate. So, it's really critical that the stocking rate is always matched to carrying capacity. And another important point to note, I believe, is that lots of people consider carrying capacity of an area of land to be a standard figure. But I think, as our environment changes, that carrying capacity is going to change from season to season and year to year. But the stocking rate is really critical. And given that this carrying capacity is a moving target, it's really important to stay on top of that and ensure that it's not that stocking rate is not in excess of the carrying capacity of an area of land. Generally, it's calculated as the number of animals carried in DSE per hectare, and it's usually calculated over a 12-month period. And it's often referred to as a key driver of enterprise profitability. I would suggest that that time is probably equally as important as stocking rate, but again, that's I won't go into detail on that point right now. We'll carry that one over for another time as well, I think. But the critical issue is that the stocking rate at any time should always be matched to carrying capacity. So the thing is that to achieve those outcomes optimally, you really need to be looking at controlling the grazing process. And the best way to control that grazing is to be running fewer mobs and bigger mobs, and ideally have more paddocks available per mob. And by doing this, it increases the period between grazing events. It provides advantage to those plants that are selectively grazed. It also gives you the potential to use stock density to improve land health, and also increase the rate of utilisation, stocking rate and pasture growth rate. So it's really important to control the grazing process. So when we look at these grazing strategies again, most of them, other than these cell grazing, planned holistic grazing and this forage-based grazing, most of them do not have the level of control required to actually achieve those positive outcomes in terms of enhancing land condition using grazing management. So it's really these three down the bottom of that list that are the key. And in terms of triggers, as I mentioned earlier, there are going to be times when you want to change grazing strategy, and some of the triggers that you might be consider or that might influence your decision to change strategy would be the change in pasture growth rate, which will occur very often with the change of season. Social factors might come into play. I know certainly a lot of holistic managers and cell grazers have dedicated holiday paddocks where animals might be set stocked for an extended period while they go on holidays, with a reliable water source, a dam, for example. Then you've got animal requirements to consider. Lots of people, single sire mate joining. You might have dedicated calving or lambing paddocks, or particular paddocks that you want to use at weaning or to finish animals. There's going to be a whole raft of reasons why you might actually adopt different strategies in your grazing management from time to time. But the key is, if you can aim to manage with as fewer mobs as possible for the longest period of time and allowing an appropriate number of paddocks per mob, then the outcomes in terms of your land management will be positive. So just to give you a bit of a pictorial a demonstration of the difference between uncontrolled and controlled grazing, and I'm probably speaking to the converted here, but essentially you've got the same grazing area and the same number of stock. So the stocking rate in both instances is the same. The difference is that on the right-hand side, where you've got this area divided into 9, the stock density will obviously be increased by 9-fold. And again, it's not a matter of raising animals through each area on a routine number of days. That movement through paddocks should be dictated or determined by the available herbage mass that's present and how much you want to leave behind. So even though paddocks might be the same area, there'll very often be differences in soil type or differences in species composition that are going to dictate or influence pasture growth. And so it's important to monitor those elements and adjust the grazing days based on what's available in the paddock and, more importantly, what you want to leave behind. And another bit of a demonstration, if you like. So generally, one of my golden rules is I believe that you need to be grazing at least 200 DSE per hectare stock density to really achieve positive outcomes in terms of using livestock to regenerate your land. So if you've got 200 DSE per hectare, you've got 3,000 kilograms available herbage mass present. You want to retain 2,000 kilograms as a desired residual. Then animals at that stock density will remove 200 kilograms of dry matter per hectare per day. So it will take 5 days to get down to that 2,000 kilogram residual. If you're grazing at 50 DSE per hectare, you've got the same amount of herbage mass present. You want that 2,000 kilograms residual at 50 DSE per hectare it will take 20 days to achieve the same outcome. The problem is at that level, and if pastures are growing, then somewhere around day 5, 6, or 7, those plants that were bitten on day 1 are likely to regrow, and such that they're at risk of being bitten a second time. And so this is where the damage is done at low stock densities and low numbers over large areas. And the importance of stock density in terms of enhancing land condition and using livestock as a tool to improve land health. Another one of the it's not necessarily a golden rule, it's a guideline that I promote, is the number of paddocks per mob and the average graze period. So again, this is adapted from Savory's textbook and looking at a range of different recovery periods, the number of paddocks per mob and the average graze period. What you notice is that at about 15 paddocks, all of these lines start to flatten out. And so based on these data, I generally recommend that the ideal minimum number of paddocks that you should be looking at per mob is around about 15. Obviously, if you've got 2 and you can create 4 paddocks, then that's obviously better. But if you're really trying to use livestock to improve your land condition, if you could look around about the 15 paddocks per mob, that gives you greater control and flexibility in your grazing management. So there's a whole raft of benefits to increasing the paddocks per mob, more control over utilisation, more plants are impacted in any graze event, you get more even distribution of nutrients, more even plan of nutrition. Livestock move frequently, they become quiet with regular moves, and you see your stock on a regular basis. And again, the mantra is grow more, use more, leave more. And looking at, say, growing 6,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare per year, an appropriate level of utilisation might be 58%. So this graph basically shows the more you grow, the more you can sustainably utilise. So the green area is the amount that you make available for stock, and then the lighter green is what you leave behind to basically enhance the function of soil processes. So in terms of assessment, the requirement of effectively planning the grazing is being able to assess pastures. And the reason that it's so important is that it is the basis of your business. And it's going to determine how much pasture you grow determines your sustainable stocking rate. And it is possible to improve profitability and regenerate the land at the same time with an adaptive approach to grazing management. And it really should become part of the daily routine. So if you can measure the pasture, plan appropriate stocking rate, plan your residual, set animal and pasture production targets, and then plan and control the grazing. But the key is to plan these figures here. Plan what the demand is in terms of the stocking rate, and then plan the stocking rate based on the available herbage mass. So for Southern Tablelands pastures, this is the growth curve that I sourced from ProGraze in terms of pasture growth. This growth curve equates to growing in an annual period 5,400 kilograms of dry matter per hectare, at an average of about 15 kilograms of dry matter per hectare per day, averaged over 12 months. So in a normal season, the critical dates are going to be these that I've highlighted. This one here coming into the non-growth period, post that period of really active growth. Then in advance of the winter, it would be important to do a stock take in terms of your available feed, and then do a check on how you're progressing through that winter period. And Obviously, everybody's going to have a different production system and changing requirements of livestock depending on your production system. This is just one example. So based on growing a bit over 5,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare, the appropriate stocking rate would be that to utilise half of what's grown. And this line represents an average stocking rate over the year of 7.5 DSE per hectare. So when it comes to actually planning the grazing, what we're trying to do is use this build-up of excess pasture over animal requirements that you're going to ideally build up through the spring period, and then ration that excess pasture out, most particularly to fill this gap where animal requirements and pasture growth are on an even keel. So you're using this excess grown through the active growth period and planning the use of that to effectively fill that gap there where the animal requirements and pasture growth are more closely aligned. And this is where the actual planning of the grazing becomes really important to achieve this in the long term. And of course, an average season never happens. So given that you're more than likely going to experience environmental variability in a 12-month period, that really emphasises the need for regular monitoring and allows a more proactive approach to changing conditions. So I just want to spend the last little bit of today on a method that we developed to assess pastures that I think is relatively user-friendly. It's a checklist. It was originated in the northern tablelands, but we've applied it in southern areas, in southeast Queensland, in Western Australia, Victoria. The principles are the same. Some of the growth curves might change, but the principles of assessing the pasture is the same. So it's a 12-point checklist, but I'm really going to focus on herbage mass assessment. And what we used to actually develop the method really was looking at a height-weight relationship between pastures. So over 10, 15, 20 years, we've cut and dried and weighed many pastures from many paddocks and developed this relationship. So if you look at these three quadrats here, the pasture height in the one in the left here is about 2 centimetres. The one in the middle is a little over 7 centimetres in height. And this one here on the right-hand side is about 15 centimetres. And so by taking the average height of the bulk of the leaf and then considering how closely spaced plants are, you can come up with a figure for to use in this height-weight relationship. So we cut the quadrats, those quadrats in particular, and this is the equivalent amount of dry matter per hectare in each of those. I think they were 1/4 metre squared quadrats, and then develop a relationship such as this. So this is the height of the pasture plotted against the dry weight of each quadrant and come up with a line of best fit. So for that particular pasture, every centimetre of height is equivalent to about 400 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. So that's a particularly dense pasture. But essentially what we want to do is measure the height of the bulk of the leaf as in the first instance. And in this instance, even though you've got these tall seed heads here, the bulk of the leaf in this example is about 10 centimetres. And then we apply a density measure based on that principle of height-weight ratio. So if you can see ground through the pasture, it's equivalent to about 200 kilograms of dry matter per hectare per centimetre. If you can see ground occasionally, such as in that photograph in the middle there, it's about 250. Most pastures in tablelands environments that are average density, and it's a good starting point, are about 300 kilograms of dry matter per hectare per centimetre. So that previous pasture of 400 kilograms per hectare per centimetre is quite high. If you were to use this figure, 300 kilograms of dry matter per hectare per centimetre of height, then it would be a good starting point to get your eye in and get a feel for the method. But people get a bit confused or caught up on the density estimates. So just as an example here, just using a couch pasture, that you can see lots of exposed ground. So it is related to ground cover, but it's more a matter of how closely spaced plants are. So in that instance, it's about 100 kilograms of dry matter per hectare per centimetre. A few more plants occupying the surface area. In this example, 200 kilograms of dry matter per hectare per centimetre. And more commonly, where you can't see gaps in the pasture, on average 300 kilograms of dry matter per hectare per centimetre pasture height. So then we apply, if we go back to that original photograph there where we had 10 centimetres of pasture and applying that density of 300 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. And by the way, this is just a centimetre ruler. So I think you can still buy rulers at newsagents, but that's all that is. So you multiply the height by the density. In this example, 10 centimetres pasture height and 300 kilograms of dry matter per hectare per centimetre. Herbage mass in that pasture is 3,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare. There are other considerations in the checklist, and I'm not going to go through these in any detail, but these contribute the 12 points. I will mention the percentage edible. I got an indication that lovegrass was an issue in some of the paddocks in the southern tablelands. So it's important when you're assessing herbage mass to consider what livestock will actually consume. So if there's lovegrass present and there is a selection of other species such that they won't be consuming the lovegrass, then you need to discount that in terms of the available herbage mass. But more often than not, winter time is the best time to be targeting those summer active species that are less palatable. And you can do that by providing supplements. And again, I won't go into any detail right now, but certainly there are specific times of the year. And again, they might be another trigger for changing your approach to the strategy for grazing management. But that's certainly something that you need to consider in terms of assessing available herbage mass at any time. This is some indications again of different densities. I'm watching the clock, and I'll speed up the process, I think, Aaron. But you can calculate key performance indicators such as pasture growth rate. So that's basically a measure of your pasture production. Water use efficiency, so the amount of pasture that you grow per millimetre of rainfall, and utilisation. And as I mentioned earlier, utilisation is really a key factor in determining potential pasture production. So there is an Excel spreadsheet that's available, and it does these calculations for you. So I'll just flick through them very quickly because I'm running out of time. But essentially, you enter the available herbage mass on day one, at the start of the period, and at the end, allowing for what stock take out. You'll come up with a pasture growth rate measure, and this Excel spreadsheet will actually do these calculations for you once you measure the available herbage mass and estimate your animal requirements. And again, entering the amount of rainfall in the period, the program will come up with a water use efficiency score for you so that you can actually keep track of how effectively your pastures are using the rainfall that's falling. And most importantly, you can keep a track of the proportion of what's grown that is utilised by stock, and this is a key production indicator. But all of these calculations are done based on your entering the amount of herbage mass that's present and getting a measure of pasture growth. So the other thing that you can then do based on herbage mass is a feed budget. And a feed budget will determine the appropriate number of stock to run based on the residual you want to retain in the paddock and what proportion of utilisation you're aiming to achieve. So based on the number of stock that you can carry and what you want to retain, you can set animal production and pasture production targets and then develop a grazing plan to control that grazing. So your feed budget using these data again, the Southern Tablelands growth curve, and again, different people are going to have different production cycles and production systems, but assuming calving in March and weaning in December, you're actually using the feed budget to distribute this the excess growth that hopefully you'll achieve in the springtime to fill in this gap when when pasture growth will be relatively compromised compared to the animal requirements. So what we need for a feed budget is an estimate of the grazable area, an estimate of herbage mass, stock requirements in terms of DSE values, and I'm making an assumption that people know what a DSE is. We can address that later if people are not clear. Estimate of pasture growth rate, and then most importantly, setting those minimum residual targets. There's tables for DSE values, and you can see that the requirements of lactating animals are significantly higher than when those animals are dry or in early pregnancy. So you need to be mindful of the changing physiology of your livestock and their changing nutritional requirements. And I should point out that the pasture assessment really is purely on a herbage mass basis, primarily because if you've got a bulk of herbage mass, then you can use different supplementation strategies to apply the most appropriate supplement for your animals to utilise the available feed most appropriately. So the feed budget identifies the number of stock that you can sustainably carry, probably puts what you already know in front of you, but this is the website where you can go to access these tools, the Excel spreadsheet to do the calculations for you. And it will look something like this in terms of the feed budget. And again, I'm not going to go into any detail. That's very busy. I just thought I might give you an example of the value of the feed budget from an example from my own place a few years ago. In 2023 was particularly dry winter, and the prediction was for a dry summer. So I did a feed budget towards the end of winter. Pastures were looking in this condition. Estimated I had on average 2,500 kilograms. Obviously, these are quite different to your scenario, but I thought rather than talking too much about numbers, I would sort of show you the impact of how you can actually effectively use the feed budget. So I had enough cottonseed on hand to get through to the end of December. So, and working on getting down not below 2,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare at the end of that period. So that was a critical date that I'd set. So develop this feed budget, again, using grazable area, time, amount of feed and animal requirements. The budget works out how many animals it was appropriate for me to be carrying. So I had 400 hectares starting from the 1st of September, planning through to the end of December when my cottonseed was I'd planned for the cottonseed to last for that period. So the time that I was looking at, the program calculated 121 days. I had 2,500 kilograms available across the area. I wanted to maintain 2,000 kilograms at the end of December, assuming no growth. The program calculated that I had 4.1 kilograms of dry matter per hectare for each one of those 121 days available. I had cows at various stages. Some were lactating and some were dry. So on average, they were 15 DSC. So the budget calculated that I could carry 110 animals. And as it happened, I had 103 on hand. So I went into that dry spell with confidence that I had sufficient feed available and I was going to end up with my desired residual at the end of that planning period. So it ended up raining, I think, towards the end of December. So growth occurred relatively quickly. By the 1st of February, they were grazing in fairly high quality pastures. And with the use of the feed budget and controlling the grazing going into the next winter with an abundance of feed available. So again, I'm just trying to demonstrate without using too many numbers, but feed budgeting really is the process that gives you information about whether to sell, keep or feed livestock, and how much needs to remain. It will tell you how many animals you can carry for how long. And there is basically these are the regenerative grazing principles: reducing the number of mobs, increasing the number of paddocks per mob, base the movement on herbage mass and develop a graze plan. And the tools for developing a graze plan can be found at this website. And I mentioned earlier, there's a graze plan and a graze plan calculator, and the graze plan that you can download or use, it's freely available. And that graze plan is wholly based around feed budgeting so that you're planning the appropriate amount of days grazing for the number of DSE that you've got in the mob relative to every other paddock on the property. And that's, to my mind, really the key in terms of regenerating pastures and managing grazing for resilience. And so I notice I've gone a little bit over time, but hopefully not too much. I've left adequate time for questions and hopefully have covered topics not with not too brief of a brush, Aaron. So I'll hand over to you.
Perfect timing in my mind, Judy. We've got
Good.
plenty of time to discuss it, but thank you so much for that presentation. That was brilliant. I was only going to write a few key takeaways, but I've ended up writing a couple pages worth.
All right.
So that was fantastic. For me, yeah, it was really good to go through firstly, like what is above is below, the plant materials and how it reflects root growth. Really enjoyed your research into looking at defoliation and that impact on root and shoots.
It's
And
so
then, of
important.
course, the mantra of the more you leave behind, the faster it grows, grow more, use more, and leave more, and how managing our residual herbage biomass can really influence those gains in not only plant health, soil health, but also livestock health and performance too.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, I think what we might do now is have some time just to look at some questions. So we've had a few pop up in the chat. First question from Tanya was, what recommendations would you have for lambing time? We have had very little growth. We are set stocking and feeding hay, oats and corn at the moment. And Tanya's based in Griffith, New South Wales.
Right. Perhaps I'll go back to one of these. I don't
Tanya,
know.
just quickly too, Tanya, you're most welcome to chuck off mute and have a chat as well.
Sure. Yeah, it's tricky. Generally, what I suggest is people aim to be lambing or calving about a month to 6 weeks in advance of this rapid growth period, so that you optimize that you're coinciding the peak demands of your livestock with the peak pasture growth period. But of course, you've only got and I'm assuming Southern Tablelands Griffith would be a similar sort of a growth curve to this. Correct me if I'm wrong, but and I've noticed most people in the southern regions and really Mediterranean environments generally are aiming to get animals or calving or lambs on the ground in the autumn, and looking to finish and wean as the pasture tends to be senescing at the end of the year. So that does obviously create challenges, and it puts significant pressure on the pastures at this time of the year when it's so critical, when your animal requirements are increasing and pasture growth is only just, if at all, above the requirements of the stock. But it's really about planning 6 months. Or what I try to encourage people to do is plan the grazing through the growth period, through the spring and early summer, to meet the requirements of your stock through the winter. And then how you plan and manage through the winter, particularly if you've got plants that are dormant or not actively growing, is going to dictate your potential growth through the spring. So you need to be sort of 6 months ahead in terms of your grazing planning with regards to actually optimizing pasture growth rate and utilization during the annual period. So I don't have a solution for you right now, Tanya, other than to say, if you're feeding stock and they're set stocked, then you would be far better to feed them in a confined area and almost put them in a feedlot and try and rest as much of your area as possible to make maximum use of the early growth period.
So we would be better off lambing in September, you think, so that way we can maximise that growth period?
Yeah, the problem is that you've only got, and I don't know how long you're looking at turning off, because you've only got such a short window of optimal, of higher pasture growth.
Yeah.
And that's why I believe most people tend to lamb in the autumn.
Mm-hmm.
So that you've got maximum growth on those lambs when you're turning them off.
Yeah.
But from a pasture perspective and from an animal production perspective, not considering the marketing aspect, that spring lambing would be more optimal. But the reality is most people need to consider the financial imperatives of livestock production. And so based on that, the earlier, autumn is more optimal, just to give you the time to actually get weight on those lambs to get them to a saleable product, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it comes back to, but to minimize the need for hand feeding during this period, if you can go into the winter with basically sort of 3,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare, then you can plan the grazing and ration that feed out such that you get to August, September with a residual not below 1,500 kilograms, and that's going to maximize your growth through the spring.
Mm-hmm.
But it's where you are now in June, it's not, if you're already hand feeding, then yeah, it's not an ideal scenario. So if you are hand feeding, what I'd suggest is to minimize the area that they've got access to so that you can optimize the growth of the pasture through the spring, and then plan the grazing so that you're leaving an optimal amount of residual, or have an optimal amount of residual at the time when pasture growth slows down.
Yeah, we've sort of got the problem also that all our dams are empty and we've just got troughs at the moment, and we've only got limited troughs out there. So we're just doing the best we can, really. So
and that's probably all you can do for now.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really a matter of come next spring when you get that pasture growth, is being much more proactive about planning the grazing.
Yeah.
So that you're actually planning to leave that residual behind, and it's that residual that you've got, say, at the end of December, when pasture growth rate is going to be slowing through January, February. So you've got your hay shed in the paddock essentially.
Yeah.
And you're actually rationing that hay. It's not hay, it's standing dry pasture, but rationing that hay, that pasture through that period where your animal demands are increasing and your pasture growth is lower.
Yeah.
But there's little that you can do now, but it really comes down to actually starting planning for next winter or next lambing in September, when your pasture growth starts to accelerate.
Yeah.
Thanks for your...
keep trying. Thanks for that.
That's okay.
Thanks for your question, Tanya. Judi, we also have another one from Elise. So Elise says, when competing with kangaroos over grazing desirable species, how do you manage your stock rotation? In some instances, the grass height of the desirable species is already well below 5 centimetres prior to grazing with livestock, while the invasive species like love grass are thriving.
Yep, and again, if you've got significant populations of kangaroos or other grazers, then you really need to factor them into the grazing plan, or take action. It's a matter of, it comes back to really controlling those elements that you can control, and if you choose to control the kangaroos or not. And I understand that more people have more or less issue with kangaroos than others. And I obviously, it's a different environment, and I certainly have my share of kangaroos, but my personal attitude is, if I can't feed a few kangaroos, then my grazing is not really up to scratch. I'm not actually growing sufficient pasture. They have to come into the equation in terms of planning the grazing. But it's a decision to either take action in terms of managing those other grazers or not. And if you've got excessive numbers, then and again, it's just a matter of controlling those elements that you can control.
Thank you for that.
I don't really have too much of an insight into kangaroo management. Sorry, Elise.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I was just going to say, so for those paddocks where that grass height is already below 5 centimetres, are they then just automatically excluded from grazing completely?
Ideally, yes.
But some of them will actually never grow above it.
It's hard for me to assess sitting in my office here, but
I might make a quick comment on that, Judi, just to explain.
Please do, Joe. Yep.
It's and it's very similar, at least, to where we are down here in East Gippsland. That our paddocks, we've got a mob of nearly 100 that are constantly here. And the recovery of those paddocks is just not happening. It's all bent grass, and that's all there is. It's less than 5 centimeters, and they like it like that. They keep it that way. Yeah. And so it becomes a really hard thing. And what happens is you end up with those species which are not palatable to the kangaroos, like lovegrass, that ends up being the dominant tussock, and all around it they eat, just right down to the ground. So I mean, I think for my context, Elise, when I can afford it, I'm going to put an exclusion fence up I'm actually just going to stop them from coming in. It's the same as what happened out, with my orchard. I had to put an exclusion over the top of it. Otherwise, every bit of wildlife in the world will come and eat it, and I get nothing. And the paddocks, I'm getting to the same point that it's no point being I would never be able to shoot every one of them, and I wouldn't want to. And so I think the only option for me is putting up exclusion fencing, and it's expensive and it's a pain. But I have noticed there's quite a few ACT farmers that are starting to do it.
Yes, and that is a pathway that we've looked down. I suppose I was hoping that there was possibly other strategies out there, but yeah.
Not really. Sorry, Elise.
Yeah, no, that's okay. It's just a personal frustration, but thank you for your time.
Yep. No, it is an issue, and they need to be factored into the program. But if you have got the resources to put up an exclusion fence, as Jared's indicating, then I think you would be amazed at how quickly those plants, those areas would recover if they're given the opportunity to rest and recover from grazing, because it doesn't matter whether it's a kangaroo or a cow or a goat or a chook. Anything that is defoliating plants will have that same effect. Doesn't matter how the defoliation occurs.
Yep. Awesome. Thank you very much.
Well, does anybody else have any questions?
There was one question that you sent through, Aaron. I don't know who sent it through, relating to compaction that I didn't address.
That's right, Judi. I've got it here with me now, if you'd like me to read it again. So
no, I think I get the gist of the question.
Yep. Go for it.
My comment was that I believe compaction is probably the single biggest issue in terms of soil degradation Australia-wide. And my general comment is that compaction is not a result of hooves, it's a result of overgrazing of plants, of too many mouths for too long. And if plants are overgrazed and the root system is reduced, then there is no habitat for the biological activity. If you don't have biological activity and roots to depth in the soil, then the soil compacts. It basically goes like concrete below. So certainly there's an issue with physical impact of hooves on the surface, but if you're maintaining a residual herbage mass of somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 kilograms of dry matter per hectare, that effectively acts like a blanket, a bit of a sponge. And if those animals are only there for a short period of time, then that bounces back quite quickly. And I guess the bottom line is that I don't see compaction as being a direct result of animal hooves. It's too many mouths for too long, overgrazing plants and reducing root systems. Which is a bit of a different take, I think, on the cause of compaction.
Fantastic.
I think I addressed the others. There was another one that was in regard to the area of I think it was a 1 hectare food forest.
Planned grazing again, within a hectare model food forest farm.
These principles apply on a hectare just as well as 100 hectares or 1,000 hectares or 10,000 hectares. Because the grazing happens one plant at a time, the individual context that you're dealing with will determine the resources that you have available in terms of water and fencing. But the same principles apply in terms of grazing management, whether you're dealing with 1 hectare or 1,000 hectares. It's the processes are identical, just the scale varies.
Well, does anybody have any other last questions? Otherwise, we might wrap it up there? I don't think so. Well, firstly, Judi, thank you so much for that. We're
pleasure.
very, very lucky to have you here today. You're a wealth of experience and knowledge, so thank you again. We will be sending out an email with the recording, so anyone that's missed out on this session can catch up, and we'll also send those details that you presented as well, Judi, around the feed budgeting and looking at pasture assessments too.
Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you for organising. Thank you for having me.
Cheers.
Stop sharing. Very good. Okay.